The first sound I heard that morning wasn't birds or wind through pine, it was metal striking metal. I was standing in freezing valley fog at the foot of my timber bridge when the chain wrapped tight around the iron rail. A hired contractor pulled it through the beams while two HOA board members held flashlights like they were supervising a crime scene. Then the padlock snapped shut. That bridge is the only road in or out of our mountain valley. Darlene Whitaker stood there in a tailored coat, perfectly groomed even before sunrise, clipboard tucked against her chest like a badge of authority. "Emergency structural closure under HOA authority," she announced, loud enough for the growing crowd behind me to hear. Behind me were stranded residents, an elderly man who needed dialysis in town, a mother clutching a feverish child, work trucks idling, engines coughing in the cold. Then Darlene looked straight at me. "You don't own this, Mr. Hawthorne." I felt the words hit harder than the frost. "I do. They just don't know that yet." A sheriff's SUV rolled up the gravel. Darlene pointed at me like I was trespassing on my own land. I pointed at the deed sitting inside my truck. They thought they locked me out. They didn't realize they had just locked themselves in. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before the chains, before the fines, before Darlene Whitaker started speaking like she owned the valley, there was just the bridge. My name is Caleb Hawthorne, early 40s. Born 2 counties over, but I grew up spending summers here on Parcel 17C, what the county records call the Timber Bridge Tract. My grandfather bought this land in 1952 when nobody wanted steep hills and stubborn pine. He built the bridge himself with milled cedar and railroad bolts, hauling beams across the creek with a borrowed tractor and a stubborn streak that ran in the blood. The bridge existed long before the HOA ever showed up with bylaws and laminated badges. Back then, this valley was quiet, a handful of homes tucked into the slopes. Hunters in the fall, smoke curling from chimneys in winter. The bridge wasn't political, it was practical. It was neighborly. That changed in the early 2000s when a developer discovered the untouched mountain aesthetic. Cabins went up downstream. Gravel roads were cut. A glossy brochure called it Ridge Hollow Estates. And with it came the Homeowners Association. At first, I didn't think much of it. The development technically ended before my parcel. I wasn't part of their recorded plat. I paid my own taxes, maintained my own access, lived my own life. But the bridge connected everything. Darlene Whitaker moved in 3 years ago. She ran for board leader within 6 months. Perfect posture, controlled smile. She spoke about property value protection and infrastructure modernization like she was running a corporate office, not a mountain valley. Grant Holloway became vice president, former insurance adjuster, always calculating risk in dollar signs. Melissa Crane handled treasury, quieter, sharp-eyed, more cautious than the other two. The first letter I received from them was polite. They called it an infrastructure alignment proposal. They wanted to standardize all critical access points within Ridge Hollow Estates. The bridge, they explained, should be transferred to HOA management for safety compliance and liability uniformity. It sounded almost reasonable. If you didn't know better. I wrote back respectfully. Explained the bridge was private property, owned fee simple by my family for 70 years, maintained annually at my expense, inspected regularly. No incidents on record. I declined. Darlene responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes at the next community barbecue. "You can't expect to control the only access forever," she said lightly, holding a glass of iced tea. Communities evolve. Control. That word stuck with me. My grandfather anticipated something like this back in 1994 when cabin traffic increased. He drafted a formal access license, not an easement, allowing neighbors to cross the bridge for passage. It was generous but careful. One clause mattered more than the rest. If any third party attempted to assert ownership, jurisdiction, or operational control over the crossing, the license would immediately revert to the owner's discretion. In plain English, if someone tried to take it, access could legally be restricted. It wasn't vindictive. It was protective. At the time, it felt like a relic, a dusty safeguard in an old filing cabinet. Then the board meeting started getting interesting. Melissa once accidentally forwarded the monthly minutes to the wrong distribution list. I wasn't supposed to receive them, but I did. Buried in page 4 was a line that made my stomach tighten. Long-term strategy, secure operational control of primary crossing to ensure compliance across upstream parcels. Another note from a later meeting read, control the crossing, control the valley. They weren't talking about safety. They were talking about leverage. Small things began happening after that. A surveyor truck parked near my boundary without notice. A community improvement proposal suggesting uniform bridge paint color. A suggestion that I provide maintenance receipts for association review. Each time, I declined politely. Each time, Darlene's tone sharpened slightly. Then came the whispering. Neighbors asking whether I was working with the board. Subtle pressure. Casual comments about how shared responsibility benefits everyone. I kept maintaining the bridge the way I always had. Replaced planks. Tightened bolts. Cleared snow before sunrise. I never once denied anyone access. I didn't want war. I wanted boundary. The first real threat didn't come face to face. It came by certified mail. Heavy envelope. Return address. Ridge Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. Inside was a formal document titled Bridge Safety Violation Notice. It cited structural instability concerns affecting community access. It referenced inspection authority I never granted. It demanded immediate compliance and warned of daily penalties if I refused. At the bottom, Darlene's signature. Neat. Confident. For the first time, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a move. And I understood something clearly in that moment as I stood in my kitchen holding that letter. This was no longer about cooperation. This was about control. The fine showed up online before the letter even hit my mailbox. $750 per day. Reason: unsafe private structure impacting community welfare. I stared at the number for a long time. $750 every day. Not a warning, not a discussion. A penalty. And they didn't even get the parcel right. The violation cited parcel 17B. I own 17C. That told me two things immediately. 1, they hadn't done real due diligence. 2, they didn't care. 2 days later, another notice arrived demanding I grant immediate inspection access to the board's appointed structural consultant. Failure to comply would trigger enforcement action, including operational intervention. Operational intervention. That phrase didn't belong in a mountain valley. Darlene didn't wait for my response. She showed up unannounced just before noon that Friday, black SUV crunching over the gravel. Grant Holloway climbed out behind her, wearing mirrored sunglasses like he was arriving at a foreclosure. Melissa Crane followed more slowly, holding a clipboard to her chest. Darlene didn't knock on my door. She walked straight toward the bridge. I stepped out from the shed before she reached it. "Can I help you?" I asked evenly. "We're here to inspect," she said, as if it had already been agreed upon. I didn't approve an inspection. She kept walking. 2 steps. That's all it took. 2 steps past the survey marker and onto my land. Grant pulled out a phone, already filming. I felt the shift inside my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "You're trespassing," I said. Darlene paused just long enough to look at me over her shoulder. "This affects the entire valley, Mr. Prody." "Hawthorne. It's private property." She glanced at Melissa, then back at me. "If you won't cooperate, we'll enforce." The way she said it wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was practiced. That was the first time I understood she wasn't improvising. This had been planned. Word spread fast. By that evening, I had 3 neighbors stop by quietly. Mr. Ellis from up the ridge shook his head and said it was wrong. A young couple who rented near the creek told me they agreed with me but couldn't get crosswise with the board. That was the phrase that kept coming up. Crosswise. No one wanted to be on Darlene's radar. Others whispered that maybe I should just let them take it to avoid trouble. that it would be easier, that fighting the HOA was like fighting a bank. I didn't blame them. Most of the cabins downstream were under HOA contracts. Fines, liens, compliance hearings, those were real threats for them. For me, it was different. I wasn't in their jurisdiction. They just hadn't accepted that yet. 3 days later, the email arrived. Subject line, emergency community vote, temporary operational control of Valley Crossing. They were calling a special session to vote on assuming management authority over the primary access bridge pending structural compliance. Pending structural compliance. They were creating the narrative in real time. If the community believed the bridge was unsafe, then taking control would sound responsible, protective, necessary. It wasn't about wood or bolts. It was about authority. I reread the '94 access license that night. The clause my grandfather inserted felt heavier than ever. If any third party asserts ownership or operational control, the license reverts. Operational control. That phrase again. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. Something felt off. The air was too still. When I walked down the slope toward the creek, I heard it. Metal clanking. Low voices. The contractor's truck headlights cut through the fog. Darlene stood near the base of the bridge while Grant handed over a heavy chain. They weren't voting first. They were acting first. By the time I reached the base of the planks, the chain was already wrapped around the iron side rail. The padlock snapped shut with a final deliberate click. A printed notice was zip-tied to the beam. Emergency closure, by order of the association. $750 per day had turned into something else entirely. This wasn't a fine anymore. This was seizure. And as engines began idling behind me and neighbors gathered in confusion, I realized something with absolute clarity. They weren't trying to inspect my bridge. They were trying to own it. The chain tightened. The padlock settled. And the valley held its breath. By mid-morning, the valley didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a checkpoint. Engines idled in a crooked line behind the chain. Men in work boots stood with hands on hips. A mother paced with her phone pressed to her ear, trying to reschedule a pediatric appointment 2 counties over. Voices rose. Not at me at first, just at the situation. Then Mr. Leonard Briggs collapsed. 72 years old. Lives in the cedar cabin halfway up the ridge. He'd been waiting in his truck for nearly half an hour, trying to reach his cardiologist's office when he slumped sideways in the driver's seat. His wife screamed. Someone dialed 911. The ambulance had to reroute 20 minutes around the North Logging Road. A rough, narrow track barely maintained in summer, let alone early spring frost. It took 18 minutes longer than it should have. 18 minutes feels different when someone's clutching their chest. When the paramedics finally loaded Leonard up and disappeared down the alternative route, the silence that followed was heavy and angry. Darlene broke it. "This is exactly why this bridge must be brought under proper authority," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If Caleb would just comply, none of this would be happening." The shift was subtle, but it was there. From board overreach to my fault. From illegal closure to my stubbornness. Grant Holloway sent out an email that afternoon framing the delay as evidence of structural mismanagement. They implied that if I'd cooperated with their inspection, the bridge wouldn't have been compromised. Compromised? It wasn't compromised. It was chained. By them. Instead of backing down, the board doubled down. 2 days later, I watched a flatbed truck roll in carrying metal barricades. They weren't satisfied with a chain anymore. They installed a second barrier 20 yards back, steel posts cemented into gravel to prevent vehicles from even approaching the bridge. A private security SUV parked nearby by sunset. Invoice amounts circulated through the HOA portal that night, $5,200 for emergency safety enforcement services. They were spending other people's dues to block land they didn't own. That evening, I found Melissa Crane standing alone near the edge of the creek, staring at the barricade like she was seeing it for the first time. "You didn't vote for this?" I asked. She hesitated. "I voted for a structural review," she said quietly. Not this. Then why didn't you stop it? Her jaw tightened. Darlene says we have implied authority because it affects community safety. And do you believe that? She didn't answer right away. This isn't legal, Caleb, she finally said under her breath. But she thinks if she moves fast enough, no one will challenge it. That was the first crack in the wall. That night, I did something I should have done sooner. I pulled every recorded plat from the county database, printed the original Ridge Hollow Estates filing from the early 2000s, compared boundary descriptions line by line. The HOA's jurisdiction ended precisely at the downstream boundary marker. Parcel 17C, my bridge tract, wasn't inside their recorded authority. Not even partially. Then I looked into the security vendor listed on the invoice. No state registration, no contractor license, no business filings, just a name and a PO. Box. They weren't just overstepping. They were improvising. The sheriff returned the following morning after several residents filed complaints. He stood between me and Darlene at the barricade. I've reviewed the deed records, he said evenly. This is a civil dispute. Darlene smiled faintly, thinking that meant neutrality. Then he added, unless someone is blocking rightful access to privately owned land. Her smile faded slightly. He looked at the chain, then at me. Document everything, he told me quietly before leaving. That afternoon, Darlene sent her boldest move yet. An email blast to every homeowner in the valley. Subject line, Special Assessment Proposal. If I refused to transfer the bridge deed to HOA management within 14 days, the board would impose a valley-wide special assessment to cover infrastructure stabilization and liability exposure. In plain terms, she was threatening to fine every neighbor unless I handed over ownership. She was weaponizing the community against me. The email ended with a line that made my hands go cold. Compliance ensures unity. Resistance ensures consequence. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about structure. It was about power. I walked back into my house and opened the old cedar filing cabinet that used to belong to my grandfather. The drawer stuck halfway like it always did. I pulled it open the rest of the way and reached for the thick envelope labeled Bridge License, 1994. The paper was yellowed at the edges but intact. I sat at the kitchen table and read it again carefully, line by line. Then I saw it. The rider clause, the one most people would skim past. If any third party asserts ownership, jurisdiction, or operational control over the crossing, all access privileges granted under this license immediately revert to the owner's discretion. I read it twice more to be certain. They hadn't just overreached. They had triggered something. And for the first time since the chain went up, I felt the balance shift. They thought escalation would corner me. They didn't realize they had just stepped onto ground my grandfather prepared decades ago. I read the clause again under the kitchen light, slower this time, like it might disappear if I blinked. If any third party asserts ownership or operational control over the crossing, access privileges granted under this license immediately revert to owner discretion. It wasn't dramatic language. It wasn't angry. It was clinical. Precise. But it was lethal. For decades, neighbors had crossed that bridge under a permissive license, not an easement, not a shared deed, not HOA authority, a license. Revocable under specific conditions. And Darlene Whitaker had just created those conditions. By chaining it, by installing barricades, by sending out notices claiming operational control, they hadn't strengthened their position. They had triggered the clause, which meant something most people wouldn't immediately understand. The moment they asserted control, the neighbor access license reverted entirely to me. Legally, the valley wasn't trapped because I refused access. It was trapped because they interfered with it. They had isolated themselves. That was the moment I stopped arguing in driveways, stopped explaining, stopped reacting. I moved from emotion to record. I pulled out tax statements dating back 20 years, survey maps, title abstracts tracing ownership to 1952, maintenance receipts, photos of the bridge over the years. I scanned everything into organized folders. If this was going to be a paper war, I would not lose it. Then I called Thomas Ellery, He doesn't advertise on billboards. No loud commercials. He's a land use litigator based 2 counties over, mid-50s, deliberate, known for winning cases no one else wants to touch. When I explained the situation, he didn't interrupt. He asked one question. Have they recorded any instrument asserting right? No. Have they filed any dedication claim with the county? No. Did you grant them inspection authority in writing? No. Silence for a moment. Then he said, "Good." I drove to his office with a banker's box full of documents. He flipped through the 1994 license rider and leaned back in his chair. "They made a mistake," he said. "I thought so." "No. They made a procedural mistake. There was a difference." He outlined the plan calmly. First, demand written proof of any recorded right to control Parcel 17C. Second, notify the county clerk of unauthorized interference with a privately held tract. Third, prepare a motion for temporary restraining order to enjoin further obstruction. Fourth, issue a cure or quit notice to the HOA demanding removal of barriers and cessation of operational claims. No theatrics. No yelling. Paper. That was the shift inside me too. The frustration I'd been carrying since the first fine started cooling into something sharper. Focused. Measured. Darlene wanted a spectacle. I wanted a record. We drafted the demand letter that afternoon. Clean language. Direct citations to county plat boundaries. Clear reference to the reversion clause. Thomas added one line at the end. Your actions have triggered suspension of permissive access rights under the 1994 license rider. Continued interference will expose the association to damages and injunctive relief. We sent it certified. Then we filed. By the time the HOA blasted their next email, I was no longer behind. Subject line: Emergency Community Vote to remove Hawthorne Bridge access. They framed it as a protective action. Claimed I was withholding cooperation. Accused me of placing the valley at risk. They scheduled the meeting for 3 nights later at the Lodge Hall. The agenda included a motion to formally assume bridge control and pursue legal remedies against me. Public humiliation. Public pressure. Force the narrative in front of the community. They thought they were cornering me. They didn't know the paperwork was already in motion. That morning, Thomas filed the petition for temporary restraining order with the county court. Attached were title records, survey maps, photographs of the chain, and the 1994 rider. We weren't asking for drama. We were asking for enforcement of boundary. By evening, I received notice that the filing had been accepted and scheduled for expedited review. I stood at the edge of the creek that night, watching the security SUV idling by the barricade. Darlene's operation looked confident. Structured, assertive. But it was built on assumption. Assumption that authority sounds stronger than ownership. Assumption that volume beats documentation. She had escalated fast, hoping momentum would carry her through before anyone questioned jurisdiction. She underestimated something fundamental. Recorded deeds don't care about momentum. They care about ink. 3 hours before the emergency vote, Thomas forwarded me confirmation. The restraining order request was on the judge's desk. When I walked into the lodge hall the next evening, Darlene was already smiling. She thought she was ending me publicly. She didn't know I had already filed. Once the paperwork was filed, I stopped thinking like a neighbor and started thinking like a case file. Every document mattered. I pulled certified tax rolls from the county website first. Line after line showing continuous payment under Hawthorne Timber Holdings, Parcel 17C, year after year without interruption. No liens, no shared assessments. No HOA subordination. Ownership wasn't implied. It was documented. Next came the chain of title. I requested the full abstract from the clerk's office. It traced cleanly back to 1952 when my grandfather recorded the original deed. No transfers to the association. No easements granted. No dedications. No amendments referencing Ridge Hollow Estates. The bridge had never left our name. Then I hired a licensed surveyor to walk the boundary again. Quietly. No announcement. No confrontation. 3 days later, he handed me a fresh survey map. One of the metal barrier posts the HOA had installed sat 2 feet inside my boundary line. Encroachment. Not dramatic, not violent, but precise. Thomas smiled when I showed him the map. Now they're not just interfering, he said. They're trespassing. I wasn't finished. The $5,200 emergency safety enforcement invoice kept bothering me. I ran the vendor name through the state contractor registry. No results. I searched corporate filings. Nothing. Thomas had an investigator make a call. The mailing address listed on the invoice matched a private mailbox in a strip mall 3 towns over. Digging deeper revealed something more interesting. The business contact on the invoice was connected to a relative of Grant Holloway. Suddenly, the urgency of the barricade installation made more sense. This wasn't just power, it was profit. Meanwhile, Melissa Crane's conscience finally outweighed her caution. She knocked on my door after dusk, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. "I can't keep pretending this is normal," she said. She handed me printed copies of internal HOA expense ledgers. There it was in black and white, repeated payments to the same unregistered vendor over the past 6 months labeled Infrastructure Advisory. Grant had approved every one of them. Melissa looked tired. "She thinks if she frames you as the obstacle, the community won't question the spending," she said. "But people are starting to ask." People were more than asking. Mr. Briggs's ambulance delay had shaken them. The young couple with the sick child had posted about it privately in the community group. A construction crew missed a foundation pour because trucks couldn't pass. I began speaking to neighbors individually, not campaigning, just documenting. 3 agreed to provide written statements about medical delays and lost income. One retired firefighter offered to testify about emergency access risk created by the barricades. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was recordable harm. To close the loop, Thomas contacted the county road inspector. The inspector walked the bridge himself 2 mornings later, measured span length, examined load-bearing beams, reviewed maintenance history. Then he issued a written confirmation. The bridge had never been dedicated to the county. It had never been accepted as public infrastructure. It remained a privately owned structure with no municipal jurisdiction. That document felt heavier than any of the others. Darlene, meanwhile, escalated her messaging. An email blast accused me of holding the valley hostage for personal leverage. She claimed I was threatening to restrict access unless the board bowed to intimidation. It was effective language. Victim turned villain. But there was a problem with her narrative. The court had scheduled the injunction hearing. Official date. Official docket number. Momentum had shifted from email drama to judicial review. Darlene responded by scheduling the most aggressive move yet. Mandatory community meeting. Attendance strongly encouraged. Vote to formalize bridge takeover and pursue enforcement action against me. She wasn't just planning a vote. She was planning a public dismantling. Grant circulated a draft resolution accusing me of negligence, obstruction, and financial harm to the community. The meeting would be held at the Ridge Hollow Lodge Hall, 3 nights before the injunction hearing. They wanted optics before law. Thomas reviewed everything one last time in his office. Tax continuity, clean chain of title, encroachment survey, vendor irregularities, county confirmation, witness statements. "All the pieces are there," he said. "You think they know?" He shook his head slightly. "They think they're stronger because they're louder." The morning of the meeting, another email reminder went out. Subject line, Community Accountability Session. Vote scheduled. Attendance mandatory for members. They thought they were about to isolate me. They thought public pressure would force surrender. They didn't know the file was complete. They didn't know the judge had already reviewed the petition. They didn't know how close they were to stepping into their own trap. By the time I buttoned my jacket and headed toward the lodge hall, everything was in place. The lodge hall had never been that full. Pickup trucks lined the gravel lot. Porch lights from nearby cabins glowed through the trees as people filed in with folded arms and tight expressions. The air inside felt thick, part humidity, part anticipation. The board sat at a long folding table at the front, like a tribunal. Darlene Whitaker in the center. Navy blazer. Perfect posture. Grant Holloway to her right, laptop open. Melissa Crane to her left, eyes lowered, hands clasped. A printed banner behind them read, Ridge Hollow Estates, emergency session. It felt less like a meeting and more like a verdict waiting to happen. Darlene tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Her voice carried cleanly across the room. Controlled, polished. As you know, the primary access bridge has presented ongoing safety and liability concerns, despite repeated efforts to coordinate with Mr. Prod. Hawthorne, cooperation has been refused. Murmurs. She continued. The association has incurred financial loss due to obstruction and delay. Emergency services were compromised. Contractors were unable to access work sites. This situation affects every homeowner here. Her eyes landed on me. Mr. Hawthorne's refusal to transfer or allow proper oversight has endangered public safety. There it was. Framed neatly, Grant stood and projected the slide onto the screen. Proposed resolution. It outlined retroactive fines, recovery of infrastructure costs, and authorization to pursue a lien against my property for damages. Lien. They were no longer posturing. They were escalating publicly. Darlene folded her hands. The motion before us is to formalize operational control of the bridge, authorize enforcement action, and protect this community from further harm. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Ballots will be distributed shortly. A few heads nodded. Others avoided eye contact. Some looked uneasy. I could feel the tension in my chest, but it wasn't panic anymore. It was timing. Before Grant could step forward with the ballots, I stood. The movement alone quieted the room. Darlene raised a brow slightly. "Mr. Hawthorne, you'll have an opportunity to speak after. You want to vote on something you don't own?" I said clearly. The words cut through the room. Silence. Complete. No shuffle of chairs. No coughs. Just stillness. Darlene's smile flickered. "This bridge affects access," I said. "It doesn't change title." Grant shifted in his seat. I walked forward calmly and connected a flash drive to the projector cable. The slide changed. A scanned document filled the screen. Certified copy of deed. Parcel 17C. Hawthorne Timber Holdings. Continuous ownership recorded. I didn't raise my voice. "This is the only recorded instrument attached to that bridge." Murmurs again, but different this time. Not agreement. Not outrage. Recognition. Before Darlene could respond, the back door of the lodge hall opened. Thomas Ellery stepped inside, coat draped over one arm. He didn't hurry. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked down the aisle and took a position beside me. Behind him came the county clerk, holding a thin folder. And then the sheriff. No lights, no sirens. Just presence. Darlene's posture tightened. "This is a private association meeting," she said sharply. Thomas nodded once. "And we're here to discuss recorded property boundaries." The county clerk stepped forward and addressed the room. "The bridge in question has never been dedicated to Ridge Hollow Estates. There is no recorded easement granting the association authority over Parcel 17C. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Grant's face lost color. I advanced to the next slide. The survey map. Red line clearly marking the HOA boundary. Barrier post installed 2 feet inside my parcel. Encroachment. Gasps this time. Darlene leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "This is intimidation," she said. "No," Thomas replied calmly. "This is documentation." I let the next page appear. The 1994 Access License Rider. Highlighted clause. If any third party asserts ownership or operational control, access privileges revert to owner discretion. Several neighbors began whispering to each other. Melissa looked like she might finally exhale. Darlene reached for the microphone again. "This meeting is about safety. And financial transparency?" I asked quietly. Grant's jaw tightened. Another slide. Invoice from the unregistered security vendor. Business address. State registry search result. No active license. Connection to Grant's relative displayed in a clean diagram. The room shifted from uneasy to electric. Darlene stood abruptly. This is irrelevant to the structural integrity of... The sheriff stepped forward slightly. Ma'am. That was enough. She froze, but her hand still hovered over the microphone. I looked at Thomas. He gave me a slight nod. Darlene inhaled sharply and reached again for the mic to regain control of the room. I met my attorney's eyes and said 2 words. Play it. Thomas tapped the spacebar. The speakers crackled once, then the room filled with Darlene's voice. Not the polished public version, but the private one. Once we control the bridge, we control everyone upstream. The recording was clear. No distortion. No ambiguity. Grant's voice followed faintly in the background. It forces compliance. Silence didn't fall this time. It shattered. Gasps. Chairs scraping. Someone muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." A man near the back actually laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Darlene's face drained of color. "That's taken out of context," she snapped. "That was a strategic discussion about safety alignment." Thomas didn't argue. He simply advanced to the next slide. The financial ledger appeared on the projector. Highlighted line items. Repeated payments to Ridgeline Infrastructure Advisory. $5,200 for emergency enforcement, $3,800 the month before for consultation, $2,600 for structural advisory. Grant shifted in his chair. The next slide showed the state registry search result, no licensed contractor by that name, then a simple graphic. Registered mailbox address. Public records linking the contact number to a relative of Grant Holloway. A low rumble moved through the lodge hall. "You're accusing me of fraud?" Grant shot back, voice cracking. "I'm presenting documentation," Thomas replied evenly. The county clerk stepped forward again, voice steady, official. "For the record, there is no recorded deed, easement, dedication, or assignment granting Ridge Hollow Estates authority over Parcel 17C, or the structure commonly referred to as the Hawthorne Bridge." He held up the file. "This is confirmed by county records." That ended any illusion. Darlene tried to regain ground. "This bridge serves the community," she insisted. "We were acting in good faith to protect homeowners." The sheriff finally spoke clearly to the room. "Acting in good faith does not grant jurisdiction." Then Thomas unfolded a single sheet of paper and handed it to the clerk. The clerk read aloud. "Order of the court. Temporary restraining order granted. Ridge Hollow Estates Homeowners Association is hereby enjoined from interfering with access to Parcel 17C pending further hearing. Status quo restored immediately. Future damages and costs subject to review." There it was. Not opinion, not emotion. An order. The sheriff turned toward Darlene. "Ma'am, you'll need to remove the barrier." The room erupted into overlapping voices. Darlene stood frozen for a moment, as if the authority she'd worn so comfortably had slipped off her shoulders. "This is outrageous," she whispered. But the tide had already shifted. Residents who had stayed quiet before were no longer quiet. "You told us he was the problem," someone shouted. "You said it was unsafe. What about the ambulance delay?" Grant tried to speak, but his words drowned in the noise. Melissa stood slowly. "I move to suspend current leadership pending independent review," she said clearly into the microphone. That caught everyone off guard, including Darlene. "You can't do that without," Darlene began. Melissa continued. "We were not authorized to assert control over private property. We were not authorized to contract unlicensed vendors. This board acted beyond its recorded jurisdiction." She looked directly at the homeowners. "You deserve transparency." Someone seconded the motion immediately. Then another voice called for a vote. But this time, it wasn't about me. It was about her. Ballots were distributed quickly, hands moving faster now than they had earlier. The result wasn't even close. Darlene Whitaker was removed as board leader effective immediately pending full investigation. Grant's resignation followed within minutes. The sheriff left with 2 deputies to oversee removal of the chain and barricades. A cluster of residents followed outside into the night air. Under flashing red and blue reflections against the trees, the lock was cut. The heavy chain fell with a dull metallic thud against the wood planks. The bridge stood exactly as it had before, unchanged. Jan moved. Free. Engines started again, not in frustration this time, but in release. Trucks rolled slowly across the boards, headlights stretching down the valley road. Inside the lodge hall, Darlene attempted one last defense. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, gathering her papers. "This community will fall apart without structure." No one responded. Structure had never been the problem. Control had. As the sheriff guided her toward the exit to ensure no further escalation, the room parted around her. No applause, no cheering, just a quiet recognition that something had ended. I stepped outside and watched the final barricade lifted away. The cold night air hit my lungs hard. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just breathed. But as headlights disappeared upstream and the valley settled back into something resembling calm, one thought lingered. Ridge Hollow wasn't the only development in these mountains. And I had already heard whispers about another board farther upstream discussing standardized crossing authority. Storms don't vanish, they migrate. The fines disappeared first. Every single one rescinded in writing. The daily $750 penalties, the retroactive liability recovery fees, the fabricated enforcement costs, gone. The association's attorney issued a formal notice acknowledging overreach and confirming reimbursement of my legal expenses pending final court review. It wasn't worded as an apology, but it read like one. Within 2 weeks, Ridge Hollow Estates adopted revised governance language restricting board authorities strictly to recorded plat boundaries. No implied control. No operational assumptions. No emergency claims outside jurisdiction. The bridge itself was formally re-acknowledged in county records as a privately held access structure under Parcel 17C. Not new ownership, just clarification, stamped and sealed so no one could pretend otherwise again. An emergency access agreement was drafted properly this time. Signed by me, reviewed by the county, limited in scope. It ensured first responders could bypass any future disputes without granting operational control to the HOA. Structure returned. Grant Holloway resigned quietly before the financial audit concluded. His name hasn't been mentioned much since. Melissa Crane stepped in as interim board leader. She doesn't speak loudly. She asks for documentation before decisions. The mood in meetings has changed. Less performance. More caution. Neighbors stopped by over the following days. Some apologized directly. "I should have said something sooner. I didn't want to get involved. I thought maybe she knew something we didn't." Others just shook my hand without words. I didn't hold it against them. Fear of authority spreads fast in tight communities. One evening, about a week after the barricades were removed, I walked out onto the bridge alone at sunset. The creek ran steady beneath the planks. The cedar beams held firm like they always had. Pine shadows stretched long across the valley floor. I stood at the midpoint and looked both directions. Upstream. Downstream. I never wanted power. I never wanted to control anyone. I wanted boundary. That's all this was ever about. Rules protect communities. They keep paint colors aligned and trash bins hidden and roads maintained. But paper protects people. Recorded rights. Clear jurisdiction. Defined ownership. When authority drifts beyond its boundary, it stops being structure. It becomes abuse. Ownership isn't dominance. It's stewardship backed by record. The valley is quiet again now. Engines cross the bridge without hesitation. Emergency lights, if they ever need to, will pass without obstruction. And whether they admit it out loud or not, everyone here understands something they didn't before. In this valley, the bridge still stands. And they'll never forget who owns it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?